Well, thank you very much for that very generous welcome. And some of it is even true, I think. And this is what I've, in discussion with the organisers, I've decided to talk about. But first of all, I'm sure all of you know the expression to be sent to Coventry. And you know the meaning of that. If you're sent to Coventry, it means that everybody ignores you and nobody talks to you. But luckily, I wasn't sent to Coventry, I was invited to Coventry. So I hope that some of you will at least listen and maybe even talk to me later on. We'll see about that. Can I also just get a sense of the audience? Can you put your hand up if you think you are from a country which nobody else here is from? Yes, what's your country?
Italy.
No Italians here? Okay, you're a winner. Anybody else?
Nigeria.
Nigeria? Any Nigerians here? Japan? No Japanese here? Bangladesh, yes? Algeria? Washrak, is that right? Allah yasallimak, yeah. No? Egypt, Isaac. Yes? Korea, no one from Korea. I'm surprised at that. I thought there would be more Japanese and Koreans, actually. But you're busy doing other things. Anyone else?
Kazakhstan.
Again?
Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan. Wow, okay. Spain. Anyone else from Spain? No?
South Africa.
South Africa. Actually, I was born in South Africa myself, so I was, yeah. We'll come to that later. Okay, welcome to all of you, and all of those who did not put your hand up. You're not being ignored. You're very welcome as well. Okay, great. What we'll do is I'll try and talk for about 45 minutes or until I get the signs, and then we'll stop, and feel free to answer or ask any questions. And also, if you have any examples of things which exemplify things I've said or contradict things that I've said, please make a note of them, because I think examples can often be really, really useful. So, as I say, I'm going to talk about this topic here. And as you heard, I'm at the Open University. This is my email, which I'll repeat later on at the end of the talk. But do feel free to write it down. So if you want to send me any questions, jokes, or insults, you can do it later by email rather than putting your hand up and doing it here. That's up to you. Okay? A little bit of background about me. This is when I started teaching before you were born in 1981. Can anyone guess the country? Sudan. I knew you'd get it. Yes, Sudan, exactly. And perhaps you can guess which one is me. I haven't changed quite that much. But this is, I was teaching at a secondary school in Sudan with small classes of only 120 students and no glass in the window and just a lovely mud floor. But it was pretty well paradise. It was a fantastic experience, actually. And that's where I started to learn Arabic as well. Since then, I've been working at the University of Edinburgh, and also at Canterbury Christ Church University, and also Bedfordshire at Crella, which was a specialist centre for language assessment. This, in fact, is Sudan again. That's not Bedfordshire, that's Sudan in the secondary school. And then these are some of my areas of interest: normalisation, which I'll talk about in a minute, discourse and genre, and more recently I've been working on using eye tracking technology for researching reading and looking particularly at the cognitive processes, the mental processes that people use as they are reading. My research was actually under test conditions, so we looked at people doing the IELTS reading test, and we eye tracked them so we could see their actual eye movements on the screen, and then we asked them questions about what they were doing to understand the processes. And it's a very interesting area. Again, a slightly different use of technology, but still technology. And more recently, I've been working on a tool called Text Inspector, textinspector.com, which analyzes texts. And I'm pleased to say I'm so proud of it, I can't resist telling you that it recently won the Elton's Award 2 weeks ago for digital innovation. And that's part of my interest in reading and looking at how difficulty in texts, but also using technology to try and understand text difficulty a little bit more. So if you want to have a look at textinspector.com or email me about it, you're very welcome. More recently, I've been working on MOOCs, surprise, surprise. And this is the publication which was mentioned a minute ago. This is now, it's just come out this week actually, and this is published by Karina in the research publishing team outside. And I'm pleased to say it's an open access publication, which means you can go online and get the whole thing for free. Yes, for free. Digitally. If you want a hard copy for a library, you have to pay for it, of course. But I really love this idea of open access publishing, because the idea is more people have access to what you write, and the discussion is more kind of engaging with everybody. So because it's free, I'm allowed to keep telling you about it, and nobody will get angry, because I'm not trying to sell you anything. Okay? So I might mention it again, you never know. But this is Beyond the Language Classroom. That's an important part of it. Beyond the language classroom, researching, that's another important part of it, researching MOOCs and other innovations, because the book has other innovations, not only MOOCs in it, which you can look about. And this was edited by my very dynamic colleague, Chan, and by me, and came from a conference that we had last year. Also, just to give you a bit more background, we've been running at the Open University. The Open University is the biggest university in Britain, actually. We have 180,000 students, which probably is small by the standards of China, is it? But 180,000 is pretty big by British standards. And we have actually, I think, the biggest number of language learners as well. And we obviously make use of FutureLearn, because that was originally an Open University innovation. And this is an example of one of the MOOCs that we've had recently in Spanish for beginners. We've also had Italian MOOCs for beginners. And the reason I'm showing you this is because I'll talk about that and the experience of that a little bit later. And that's something that we've been quite interested in developing and attempting. So some of what I'm going to say derives from our experience on those MOOCs. But first, before we go into that, I want to have a look at some interesting innovations, technologies, and inventions. And I want you, as you look at these pictures coming out, I want you to say to yourself, what do these technologies have in common? Okay? There are about 8 or 10 of them. Here's one. Have you ever seen such a creature before? So you've got this interesting machine on these rails, obviously much faster than this slow coach here, zooming along the track. Have you ever seen such a thing? Okay, next one. What is this? It's like a personal helicopter. Can you see that? With the blades below and the person on the top, unfortunately militarizing it. Have you ever seen one of these in action? Why not? It's an old photo. No? Haven't seen one in Daniel High Street? Is that the precursor to the Amazon drone? I don't know. I love this one of my favorites. Okay. Have you ever seen such a thing as this? What does this have in common with the previous ones? That's the question to think about. Okay, so you've got this interesting idea of actually looking at somebody on a kind of screen and then speaking. I'm not quite sure what the funny hat is all about. Is that just an extra, or is it part of the device? There must be some, yeah, because it's connected, so it must be some kind of, maybe it goes into the brain, I don't know. Anyway, have you ever seen one of these? Have you got one at home? No? It's very pretty. Another one? I assume these are some sort of gas balloons to lift the thing up. And then you've got the movement. Have you seen one recently in Coventry, anybody? No? This one? Velocipede aquatique for hunting ducks. Don't see these on the ponds in Coventry, no?
Water bike.
Well, yeah, it looks like it, doesn't it? And then you've got the things, and then the poor duck. Lovely. Not got one of these at home in the cupboard somewhere? So this was actually designed in the Second World War for listening for incoming aeroplanes, to try to get early warning of incoming aeroplanes. But the fact I've never even seen it before I prepared for this talk shows you a little bit about how successful it was. I love his ears there sticking through. This one? Not a torture device. No. This is supposed to be a hangover remedy of some sort. You see, these are cubes of ice all over. She doesn't look particularly happy, but that's maybe because of the party last night. I don't know. Anyway, hangover remedy. You don't have that? Never tried that one? What about this one? It's a portable radio, of course. Lovely, with a nice hat as well, just to ward off the sunshine. This one, the isolator. The author at work in his private study, aided by the isolator. Outside noises are eliminated, so the worker can concentrate with ease upon the subject at hand. Don't you use that every day? Would it be good in the library, perhaps? We should get Coventry, the University Library, to get some. No, it might be a little bit warm. Yeah, what exactly is this? Like a little nose. I don't know what it is. Peculiar. Anyway, the isolator. This one, I love this one. Seaside at home, the Niagara wave and rocking bath. So you sit in there, holding on. You must have a moustache to use this machine correctly, an Edwardian moustache. And you rock back and forward to get that wave motion. Okay, maybe that's a good idea as a Christmas present for somebody. What do you think? This one, I think, looks extremely dangerous to me. And I'm not sure that she looks very happy that the man has strapped her into it and is about to set her off. Well, we're not quite sure where she landed, but anyway. Yeah, slightly. No more rain-soaked cigarettes. Lovely. Look at that, and the cigarette there sticking up so it doesn't get wet. Fantastic. And I think this is possibly the last one. Lovely. And now I think this one's workable, actually. I want one of these. But basically it's a little umbrella which sits on top of your hat to keep you dry. Okay, one more. A lovely sort of bicycle. So the question then is, what do all of these have in common? Anybody? They're old. Yeah, anything else? Movement, except for the cigarette.
Innovations that never got commercial success.
Absolutely, they're innovations which failed, effectively. None of these is what I would call normalized today. Nobody uses them in a way like as we use a pen or a book or any other technology. They're basically failed inventions and innovations. Okay? Sorry? Well, I suppose you could argue that was a precursor. That's absolutely. In fact, that one looks rather nicer than some of the ones we have now, don't you think? Nice hat to go with it. Yeah, exactly. They could be. You could say some of them are a precursor, even, for example, the bicycle and some of those other things. But nonetheless, in that form, let's say, they never became normalized. Now, let's think about MOOCs. Could this be the next failed invention or the failed innovation? Could it be? Do you think people in 10 or 20 years' time will laugh as you were laughing at the poor man with his radio hat? Will they be laughing at MOOCs and say, ha, 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 those foolish people back in 2017 who thought that MOOCs were so great, where are they now? They've gone. They've disappeared. Okay? And I think it's quite important to start thinking about that, because at the moment we seem to be in what you could describe as a flush of enthusiasm and emotion for MOOCs, so much so that we even have whole conferences devoted to them, more or less, and books devoted to them as well. But nonetheless, I think it's important, hence the question marks here, that we actually reflect a little bit and think about whether these things are actually going to disappear like the inventions that we saw before, or whether they'll in fact be in some way successful. So this brings me to the debate on what I call normalization. Normalization was an idea that I discussed in this article many, many years ago, 14 years ago. And this article, if some of you are writing your MA dissertations and thinking about future publication, if you want an article to be successful and read widely, this example suggests you should have no research in it at all, just some sharp and critical ideas and a few big fancy new words. Anyway, for some reason this doesn't have any original research in it. It's basically reviewing aspects of technology in language teaching and learning, looking at what people thought in 2003 and trying to reshape things and think about things a little bit differently. But nonetheless, it seemed to hit a chord, and it's been, I think, downloaded, or it's been referred to on Google Scholar more than 700 times. But as I'm saying to you, I don't think that's because of the quality of the article. It's to do with the idea of normalization, which I think people thought was quite interesting. And you can see here, normalization is defined as the stage when the technology becomes invisible embedded in everyday practice, when it's hardly even recognized as a technology, taken for granted in everyday life. So, for example, can you give me an example of a normalized technology? Maybe one that you can see. A phone, computer, projector. But so far you've given me all electronic ones. Again, electronic. Let's think outside the box. Piece of paper. Paper is a technology, absolutely. What about stairs? This is a technology. What about the chair that you're sitting on? What about the button in your clothing? What about shoelaces? What about pencils? Glasses. For me, one of the most important technologies. Now, some of you are looking and thinking, huh? Is that really a technology? I can see you looking doubtful, but don't say anything because they'll hear you on the internet, okay? Just think it. But nonetheless, the point is that we don't see these as technologies because, in my definition in that article, they are so normalized. They've become such a part of what we do all the time. Like, for example, those of you who wear glasses, can you remember putting your glasses on this morning? I can't. I know I didn't sleep with them. I took them off last night. I can't remember that either. But it's so normal in my practice to do it, I don't even think about it. I just completely forget about it. It's normalized in my practice. And look at these technologies. Are they normalized for you? Well, the first one is a lovely bridge in Japan. We all know about bridges. We all walk across them every day without thinking. So they must be normalized in our practice. We don't even think it's a technology. Second one, chopsticks, I put there because for some of you it will be super normalized. And for others of you, you will struggle to use them. So that's an example of different technologies. Again, did you ever think of chopsticks as a technology before? But of course it is. It's just a normalized one for many people. And finally, this one, Twitter, of course. How many of you have tweeted today? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 5 of you. So is it normalized for you? For you, sir, is it normalized for you? Do you tweet on a daily basis? Yeah, okay. So it's part of your practice. Okay, but for some of us it will be not normalized. We may do it only once a month and not be quite sure how to use it. And for some of us we'll hate it and we'll never use it. Yeah, and that shows that, of course, normalization can be different for different technologies, different people, different societies. So in China, for example, is there Twitter in China? No. What's the equivalent? Is there an equivalent? Again? Is that normalized for you, for example? Yes. Yeah. So again, normalization can be different, technologies can be different across different cultures for obvious reasons. Okay, in some of the later research that I've done, I've looked particularly at the contextual and the social dimension, referring to such wonderful writers as Mercer and Fisher. Neil Mercer was at the Open University. He's written some really interesting things about social dimensions in what they call a neo-Vygotskian approach to, well, not to technologies, but I think it can be applied to technologies, which is what I wrote here in this article in 2011. What about in language education? When we talk about normalization here, the important thing is to recognize that learning must be the priority, not the technology. And this is sometimes something we often forget. We often put technology first, but normalization implies no. The technology must be the servant, not the master. The key thing we must focus on rigidly is the learning, in our case, language learning. That must be the priority in everything that we do. And we'll try and make that the priority as we talk through the rest of the talk. And another concept is to go beyond the wow factor. There was an interesting article in the 1990s called Beyond Wow. And what this means is when many technologies are new, we think, wow, they're fantastic. And we think this will change the whole world. It will revolutionize everything. But of course, an important thing is to calm down, be sober, be relaxed, and to go beyond the wow factor to see the benefit of the technology for our actual learning, not just because it's glittery and wonderful, think it's automatically going to change everything we do. So, very briefly then, let's look at how normalization seems to happen with technologies in general. Very often we have early adopters, people who jump in and get the latest technology as soon as they possibly can. So who here has the latest iPhone? Don't be shy. Okay, 3 or 4 of you. Okay, so you obviously thought, I must have this, it's going to be so much better than the next one. You are an early adopter, and thanks to you, the money that you put into it, you're paying for the improvement of it for the rest of us who will come along later. And that happens. That's what early adopters do, actually. They help to fund the next development. But many people are not early adopters. They are ignorant or skeptical of an innovation, and they do not take it up immediately. That's like those of you who do not use Twitter, for example. You probably think, A, I don't know what it is. B, I don't think it's really useful for me. But some of you, early adopters, are already into Twitter and use it constantly. Very often, this is the next stage. This is just a general sequence that we often take. Very often, we will try it once and see, well, there's no relative advantage to me. This was the case with me with, for example, Facebook. I'm on Facebook, but I can't see any advantage for me. So I hardly use it, sadly. But then other people try it again and think, oh, okay, this has got something that I really, really like. I can link up with people from my old school days or whatever it may be. And then they start to use it more. This stage number 5 is one I want to focus on. Very often there's a stage where we fear the technology, or conversely, we give it too much respect and we start to depend on it too much. So a good example is microwave ovens. When I was in my 20s or so, microwave ovens came in, and some people said, oh, they're very dangerous. You can't stand in front of them. You'll catch horrible diseases. And they're really horrible. Other people said, no, I'll throw away my cooker and I'll cook everything in the microwave. And of course, neither of those two is quite right. There's no need to fear them, as we now know. There's no need to depend on them excessively. Most people now have a microwave which they use for certain things, but not for everything. They do cooking in an oven as normal. Isn't that true? So microwave ovens are now normalized some people don't use them, of course, but normalized in the practice of many people. So typically this is a stage we go through before normalizing and normalization occurs. Now let's think about MOOCs. I think that MOOCs, probably we're here somewhere. We're at this stage. Fear or possibly excessive dependence. We'll talk about that as we go. Okay? Many people, not everybody, many people know what a MOOC is. I tried this out in the last week, and quite a few people, even in education, in language education, say, what's a MOOC? They don't know what it is. So for many people, they have not gone beyond this stage. But for others, perhaps we are the early adopters, do you think? I don't know. We people here in this room, maybe. For others, we are moving towards this stage. But I think we're still here. I don't think we're at the stage of normalization for reasons that I will talk about in a few minutes. I think we're still roughly at number 5 in terms of the scale. And notice, of course, normalization is not automatic. It doesn't happen with all technologies, as we saw with the technologies I showed you at the beginning. Sometimes they are not normalized and they are not used. Okay, let's just look a little bit at an example here. This is an example of excessive fear. Where even relatively recently, only a year ago, people were talking about the danger of mobile phones. With every new technology, virtually, with every new technology, particularly electronic ones, there's a fear of some of the dangers that it can have. You've got fears about Google and all kinds of fears. There's lots of fears around, but at the same time, sometimes there's excessive awe. In other words, people think they can do everything. And just putting into Google MOOCs revolution, you'll get lots and lots of hits. Because people see here, MOOCs will revolutionize corporate learning and development. MOOCs, the revolution has begun, says Moody's. So what do they know? But nonetheless, MOOCs are basically seen by some people as the revolution. They will change everything we do, which again implies we're at the awe stage of the normalization process, or we could be, or some of us are. So let's look then a little bit at MOOCs a bit more. Are MOOCs normalized? I've implied I don't think that they are, but are they normalized for learners? Are they normalized for teachers and also for administrators? That's another question. Are they normalized for all the stakeholders, or just for some of them, or for none of them maybe? Next, is normalization for MOOCs actually desirable? It's not necessary that a normalization of a technology is necessarily a desirable thing. And we, as we're in the awe bubble of MOOCs, we think, of course it's desirable, that's why we've got this lovely conference. But we do need to think about this and say, is it desirable to normalise MOOCs in the current form, for example, that we're using them, or should we change them radically? What should we do with them? How can we achieve normalisation if we think it's desirable, and what obstacles might lie in the way? What should we do in order to see if we can get it to work? And again, beyond the wow factor, we must avoid too much optimism and enthusiasm, and we must think critically about it, about the whole situation. Otherwise, we might go wrong. So let's look then at key features of MOOCs. Well, obviously, as the name tells you, they are massive, they're open, they're online. Quite often there is low tutor-student interaction for obvious reasons. If you've got 50,000 people learning, and I don't know, let's say 20 staff monitoring, you can't have much time for interaction between the tutor and students. If you compare it with a classroom or even with this lecture theatre, okay, there's not much opportunity for interaction to take place. Very often the mode of learning in a MOOC is transmission, again, probably for this very same reason. It's much easier to put some information onto a MOOC for learners to read about or learn about from, rather than to interact with them and ask them questions and get feedback from them. So very often, by its very nature, a MOOC is in transmission mode. There's a social dimension too. If you compare it with a real classroom, the social dimension is reduced. There is some, of course, because most MOOCs have a forum, they have interaction of some sort, but nonetheless, compared to a classroom which is face-to-face, it's much more difficult to get that social interaction in it. So these are some of the almost natural characteristics of doing education and learning in the MOOC way. That's just how it pans out. So maybe this is our typical MOOC learner. What do you think? With the isolator, all on his or her own, okay? But hoping through these bottles or whatever to get some link with some other person elsewhere if they want to. Maybe they don't, as they're in the isolator. But this is one element of MOOCs which I think we have to deal with. Of course, this is exaggerating it a bit because there is a lot of interaction on MOOCs, but it's not as much as in a face-to-face context. Now, I want to try and look at this from a, if you like, from a theoretical perspective. And what we're trying to do is evaluate MOOCs to see where we are with them and where we should be with them. So I want to take here what I think is a really nice formulation from Jane Willis. It's quite old, but it's taken from the task-based leaning. Sorry, task-based leaning would be nice. Task-based learning, and this is from 1996. And basically, she is trying to define the key areas of language learning in 4 points. The first one is exposure. The second one is use. The third one is motivation. And the fourth one, she calls it desirable, is what she says instruction, or a focus on form is what they sometimes describe it as. So you've got, as I would say, input, output, motivation, and a focus on form. Now, if you think that these are 4 conditions for learning a language, do you agree that they are? In very general terms, but we can only speak in general terms at this moment, I think it's right that these are 4 important, I would say, all of them essential keys, actually, for learning a language. And let me give this to you in a different form slightly. So, number 1, I've moved them around. I think motivation is actually probably the most important one. And this is what I would call generally affect. So this is how you feel about the learning process that you're going through. If you hate your teacher and you hate the language that you're learning, you're not likely to go very far. Isn't that true? Even with a big stick behind you. Okay? So affect is a really important key for language learning. Motivation, or I would call it more broadly affect, the feeling, the will that you have towards what you're studying. Second, input. Now, I think we need to think about the quantity of input and the quality of input. I think it's impossible to learn a language unless you have a good quantity of input. In other words, a lot of listening, a lot of reading, okay, if you want to learn the language in all of its skills, okay? But equally, the quality must be right. And when I say quality, I also mean the range of kinds of listening and kinds of reading that you have to do. If you do a class, for example, on conversational Italian, and your input is only limited to conversational bits and pieces, you will not be fluent in all of Italian. You will not be able to read Dante, for example. Okay? But of course it will be good enough in itself, but still, for the full learning of the language, you need a huge amount and a huge quality of input. Output, likewise, we need good opportunities for speaking and opportunities for writing. And finally, focus on form is, in my view, linked with feedback. The importance of noticing when you go wrong. If you don't get feedback from somebody, whether that be your mother or father when you're learning your first language, or a teacher or somebody else or a native speaker when you're learning a second language, if you don't get that kind of feedback, even if it's somebody looking at you saying, "What do you mean?" That's feedback, isn't it? If you don't get that, you don't know that you're going wrong. So this, I think, is an important thing. I don't think it's optional, as Willis put. I think it's essential, actually. So let's look at MOOCs. And I put L MOOCs because we're focusing on language MOOCs specifically. First of all, let's look at motivation. Do L MOOCs work in this? Well, yes, they do, I think. On the whole, MOOCs are really motivating. They're fun, but they can be a bit lonely. That's the isolator again. And they need support. The student will need support often. But nonetheless, affect is usually, because they're new and exciting, we think, wow, okay, I'll try this MOOC, it's great. And most of the feedback we get is about good motivation. Input, on the whole, input is not too bad, I think, because you can give a lot of listening, you can give a lot of reading, basically, but nonetheless, it's a bit one-way, not very interactional and with limited genres. But nonetheless, in terms of input, I think MOOCs can be fine. However, output, not nearly so happy, I don't think, because it's very difficult in this mode for people to practice their speaking, practice their writing, and, of course, number 4, get feedback on their speaking and their writing. So in these two areas, which I think are essential for language learning, MOOCs, I think, are weak or difficult to do, difficult to achieve in those areas. And we need to be aware of that. We need to go beyond wow and say, hold on a minute, MOOCs are not a panacea. They can't do everything, particularly in these two areas, if you agree with me. So, in those two areas, I think we have some problems. So, the summary of this part is that full normalization of MOOCs will be inhibited by these factors. Students, if they think they can learn a whole language from a MOOC, they will be dissatisfied, attendance will decline, and massive might become minuscule. In other words, numbers will go down and people will think, oh no, that's a failure. In other words, if the expectation is too high to start with, then there's a serious danger of it all failing. So, what can we do? Well, I would suggest, A, we need to pay more attention to these shortcomings. In other words, go beyond wow and be critical and thoughtful about what a MOOC can do, but also what it can't do. Also, I would argue we need to research MOOCs more. We also need to think about the design of language MOOCs and the operation of language MOOCs to take account of gaps and shortcomings which we might identify. We think very importantly we need to recognize that MOOCs are not the whole solution, merely on product. And you might say to me, well, Stephen, of course we know that, silly. We never said MOOCs were the be-all and end-all. Yeah, but some people start to think that. With any new technology, you start to think it will solve everything. That's the lesson from the research into normalization. So we need to avoid that, and we need to manage the expectation, for example, of the students to make sure they do not think it will do more than it can. And also to make them realize as students, they need to do certain things which the MOOC will not provide them with. So that's expectation management. And this means, of course, we need to offer or plan for additional elements outside of the MOOC, or at least advise students of the need for that really clearly so they don't get, if you like, overblown ideas of what they can achieve and what they will do. In other words, we need to think about listening, speaking, and listening again maybe, and think about how MOOCs can be improved. Otherwise, we're in danger of MOOCs dying as these technologies have died, or at least morphed. So, what can we do? First of all, research the obstacles to normalization. In other words, look at why MOOCs are not normalizing, if they are not normalizing, and then take that evidence to innovate, try something different, implement it again, and research again and see if we are doing it better. But always with a critical perspective on what the MOOC can do and is doing. The research can be qualitative and quantitative. I'll give you some examples. And this book here, did I mention this book before? I can't remember. This book here, the point is researching MOOCs, not taking them for granted, but researching them. And I think that obviously we need to keep doing this as much as we can, researching them critically and trying, if you like, to see what they need to have in addition. So let me return then to the example of the Open University Spanish MOOC, one of the ones that we've been doing. You'll notice here the date, the time, the hours per week, and also there's a certificate that you can get. And this is starting to manage the process of the MOOC for students. Give them a sense about how long it will take, how long they're expecting, and so on. This is part of the management of expectations that I mentioned, but I think we still need to do more besides that. So, in this MOOC, let me show you some of the statistics as an example. This happens to be one of the ones we did last year. You've got 49,000 joiners. You might say, whoopee, it's a success. 49,000 people, we can go home now. But of course, that's not the full story. You have people who drop out and disenroll, unenroll. You have some who continue. This is what we call the actual learners, not the joiners, is much less, actually. Look at that. Active learners, these are people who actually engage with the MOOC online. Returning learners are those who do it week after week. Notice the numbers are going down. I was going to talk for 10 minutes more anyway. No problem, don't worry. And then social learners, these are people who interact with the social forums. That's quite an interesting statistic, isn't it? So you see, you've got 9,000, which is 30%. And then fully participating learners are those who go right the way through, 15%. Now, does that surprise you? Is that bad? Now, for us at the Open University, with years, in fact, decades of experience of online learning, this is good. We think this is a positive thing, because actually very much with online and distant learning, there's a huge dropout rate. Sometimes you end up with only 5% of students at all. And I'm sure you're all aware of that. So now this is probably actually slightly below the average for MOOCs, and I'll show you in a minute the average for MOOCs. But nonetheless, it's I would say, pretty typical and pretty expected. So in fact, this is, I'm sorry it's such a big screen with lots of numbers on it, but this is the actual Future Learn, what they call the run measures, explaining some of the figures that we had before. So joiners, those are the people who join, surprise, surprise. Leavers are people who leave, who unenroll. Learners are those who viewed at least one step at any time. That's not a very high criterion, actually, is it? Active learners, you can read it yourselves. The average number of active learners, of course, is 81%. Returning learners, those who complete at least a step in 2 distinct course weeks. Social learners, comments, typically 38%. Fully participating learners, typically 21%. So the MOOC that we did was slightly less than that. And that gives you some information about what they like and don't. But of course, you need a lot more data to understand what's happening with it. So if we go back to this, you'll see that fully participating learners is a little bit lower. So of course, what we should immediately do is research why it's lower. Is it because that the averages I showed you before are not for language MOOCs, they're for MOOCs in general? I think language MOOCs are actually slightly more difficult, partly because of the points we made about output and input. And therefore you might find, I don't know the facts about this, you might find that the statistics are lower for language MOOCs. But anyway, back to the researching side. So you could get quantitative data, such as what I've just shown you, but also, of course, qualitative data will tell you a lot more about why these things are happening. I think we need to focus on students' progress towards normalization. In other words, one of the questions we should be asking them at the beginning, and then again at the end, relates to their familiarity and happiness and ease with the technology that they're using. So a simple question would be, have you done a MOOC before? Are you at ease with the MOOC format? You ask them that at the beginning, you ask them that at the end. And you hope, of course, there'll be a significant improvement in their relaxation, their normalization of the MOOC format and all elements of the MOOC. You could do a lot of research into normalization of each element of the MOOC. For example, the forums, the interactive activities, and so on. And that kind of research is really important, I think. Of course, the aim is to identify gaps. Maybe things I've mentioned already, like output opportunities. Did you feel there's enough time for speaking or for writing? Probably not. Opportunities for these are areas which are likely to be limited in a MOOC, and we have to think about how we can actually remedy these gaps. Is this one way of remedying the gap? I mean, she's obviously actually interacting in some sort of video format, possibly with another student. So it could be that some of these gaps could be remedied by encouraging more student-student interaction, so it's not student-tutor interaction all the time. But whatever we choose to do, we need to plan for the gaps, and most importantly, we need to be clear with the learners that these gaps exist so that they can take measures to overcome them. And a simple example, we often in the Open University find that our students have set up their own Facebook group. Let's say they're learning Italian. They set up we don't say set up a Facebook, we encourage them, of course, but they often set up their own Facebook group. They even meet together in a cafe together to interact and practice the language. They are making their own attempt to overcome the gaps which are there in the process. That's with ordinary Open University courses, but it could equally happen, of course, in MOOCs, if the geography allows it. But it could, of course, be done online, couldn't it? So this is one of the questions that we're asking our current learners. You can learn a language online. This is what we asked them before, the same question afterwards. And luckily, a lot more people said yes after the MOOC. So they believe more that you can actually learn a language online than they did at the beginning. Okay, now, I don't know if that's statistically significant. We've just pulled the data out. But nonetheless, it implies that something is going towards normalization in terms of their attitude towards it. They're saying, okay, I now really believe, I'm one of those who believes that online learning does actually work for languages. And of course, another thing we might focus on in our research, if we're researching our MOOCs, is perception, students' perception of their new knowledge, skills, and attitudes. In other words, we ask them before and after about their perceptions to see, are they feeling more normalized in their use of the technology now they've actually gone through the process? Which bits of the technology are not normalized for them? Which bits don't they like? Which bits don't they feel comfortable with? These are all important parts of the normalization process. So in summary, I'm terrified of getting the time. No, she's given up on me. No, oh, all right, good. Okay, so in my view, MOOCs are not yet normalized for reasons that I mentioned. You could argue that they will never be fully normalized as a self-contained language teaching and learning tool. But why should they be? If I'm right, as I've been saying so far, they have their place like a microwave oven has its place. We're not asking the microwave to do all the cooking tasks in the kitchen. We're not asking the MOOCs to do all the tasks for language learning. But if that's clear to everybody, then MOOCs have a chance of being normalized in themselves up to the value that they can possibly have. But I'm saying we need to think beyond that and not make the assumption and not imply to students, and in fact we must be very explicit to students, that MOOCs can do X, they cannot do Y and Z. You need to do that yourselves, or we need to find other ways of doing it. Maybe as we're trying to sell them to students in inverted commas, even if they're free, maybe we're not yet actually warning them enough because we want them to engage, and therefore perhaps we're not being enough critical or, if you like, careful enough in the way that we sell them. So normalization for me requires more research into MOOCs, leading to planning, and then more research again to see exactly what is working and what is not working. I think one area of our research is to focus on obstacles to normalization. Also, we must base our research, it seems to be, on language learning theory. I gave you Jane Willis's, if you like, her potted view about what learning a language needs, but we need to be more critical if we're doing deeper research and actually base our research on language learning theory, thinking about what is necessary to learn a language, what do MOOCs have, and what do they lack in relation to that kind of theory about language learning. And then, of course, identifying gaps, and then planning for the gaps and planning for alternatives. As I've said, one thing might be to get students, encourage students themselves to be a bit autonomous and self-starting and form their own interactive groups online in which they practice their Italian phrases or whatever it is they're learning themselves. Now, we could be more top-down and we could organise the forums for them, but if you've got 40,000 students, that can be quite difficult. But we could at least try and make students aware and get them thinking about how to do these things themselves. That's another way of perhaps thinking about it. And particularly something I've said several times today, we need to raise awareness of learners and teachers of the limitations of what we're doing and how to get around them. And we hope that if we do these things, we'll end up with normalisation as far as we want it, and also fame and great riches and wealth and general happiness, and even a nice hat if we're lucky. So at that point I will stop. Spot on. I'm obedient, if nothing else. Now I'll leave this up here for the moment, but in a few minutes I'll put up my email again. That's my email, open.ac.uk. And did I mention this book? I can't remember. My memory's so weak, I can't remember. And here, maybe you need, I think out in the foyer you'll find some special devices to calm you down after the excitement of the talk. But let's go back to this summary here, and shall we start inviting some questions?